Thank you, Junwei, for introducing me and introducing us to stage. I'm very honored and happy to be here to be moderating these sessions, this panel. We have a list of very distinguished speakers and very internationalized speakers. They come far to be here. They have traveled far to be here and to discuss this China new game plan and share their insights with us. We have speakers from Hong Kong, from United States, and I'm very happy that we have a homegrown Singaporean academic who's US trained, Professor Ang Yuan Yuan. She came from Johns Hopkins University, and then Li Cheng 教授，香港大学，Paul Handler, Director Chair Carnegie China, and 北京大学姚洋教授 and Director of EAI East Asia Institute, Professor Paul Hoffman. Thank you very much. I will not hold up and take more time, so we just start with our panelists, and we hope everybody will have a few minutes to share their viewpoint first, and after that, I'll ask a few questions, and we hope to have questions from the audience so we can be more interactive. And pardon me if I suddenly switch to Chinese because English is still not my most comfortable language, but I'll try my best. Okay, thank you very much. We kick off first with Professor Yao Yang from Beijing Daxue. So the first question is about China's economy. The state of China economy, because there are a lot of views and we look at the statistics, but there are pessimistic views and optimistic views, and I think people are a bit confused, maybe uncertain about actually, so what is it? Is China economy bottoming up? 它在触底吗？它在触底反弹吗？ And does it still enjoy the very good prospects that people used to believe? Yeah, Yao Yang.
Okay. I know that there have been a lot of doubts about China's economic growth. If you look at the headlines, say on New York Times, we see something like, how do we manage China's decline? We use decline, not even recession. But to me, China's economy is still full of potentials. The economy itself has, I wouldn't say no problem, but little problem to me, right? So to me, China can still maintain a potential growth rate between 5 and 5.5. I think that's very easy for China to achieve. Okay. Many people also have doubts about like a decoupling, like China's slowdown of technological progress. We already listened to experts about the decoupling, but I want to say a few words about China's technological progress. So if you look at the sectors that are going to dominate the economy, not just in China, but also in other countries, I think we have to say that's AI, alternative energy, and EVs. And in all three areas, China actually leads the world, right? AI, China does not have the highest technology, but China has the widest application. Alternative energy, China produces 90% of solar panel and probably 90% of wind power equipment, right? EVs, China produces 60% of world total, right? And China's technology, the most advanced EV technology is 1.5 generations ahead of Europe, right? And its cost is 20% lower, okay? So that's China's strength. We can also think about the future technologies like fusion, quantum computing, quantum communication, and also photonic chips. China, all in those areas, all leads the world. Okay, so I believe China still has a lot of potentials. But how to explain China's bumpy road of recovery, particularly this year? I think mainly because of the government's intentional actions to correct some of the problems in the economy. For example, the housing sector, right? So in 2021, the housing sector was about to have bubbles. So the government decided to take some actions, right? So then we have seen this 2.5-year decline in that sector. There may be some overshooting of policy adjustments, but the direction is correct. Another sector is local government's debts. So the central government was quite determined to correct this huge borrowing, repeated borrowing, debt cycle among local government. Okay. So that caused local government spending to contract, particularly in this year. So I think those are the two main reasons why China's recovery has been bumpy in this year. But starting in July, the government has realized that there were some problems, right? So the government began to take actions. So if you look at the data released for August, September, then we see a lot of positive signs. And the surprise was actually 2 days before, right? So the government announced 1 trillion RMB special government debts, okay? And in the meantime, the government said it's going to roll ahead next year's 2.7 trillion debts to this year. So which means this is, to me, a 3.7 trillion RMB stimulus package. And don't forget, about 2 months ago, the government announced kind of a rescue plan, right? 1.5 trillion to local governments to pay back their debts accumulated over the last 5 years. So total 5.2 trillion stimulus package. I believe this package is going to work. So if you ask my opinion, I think the Chinese economy is going to button up probably by the end of the year. Let me stop.
Thank you very much, Professor Yao. So we just, actually there was a news 2 days ago and a lot of people have not paid attention to it. There is almost a 3.7 trillion stimulus package announced by the全国人大常委会, so the NPC. And we're happy to hear that. And so you were saying there are problems, but the direction is correct. Let's move to Professor Director Hoffman. And so what do you think about the Chinese economy and what should be done? How should we use this stimulus package to give it a proper boost, to give the economy a proper boost? Thank you.
All right, thank you. Well, look, I agree with much of what Yao Yang said. I think if you look at the supply side of China's economy, it's actually remarkably well. There's a great rotation going on from real estate and infrastructure to manufacturing and industry. And pulling that up, and that's very much in Xi Jinping's interest. He's been saying that he wants that. It's happening. Pulling that off with, well, a growth rate that hasn't gone below 3%, that was the second quarter, and now is back to something like 5%, is pretty remarkable. There's lots of issues to be dealt with. There's lots of bad debts in the system now because of the collapse of the real estate development. And hopefully nobody will have invested in evergreen bonds in this room. But China can handle that. So talk of a banking crisis, frankly, I find very overblown. But it will need work out and it will need attention, and it will probably mean that some financial repression will remain necessary for the next decade or so. It basically means paying depositors less for their money in the bank. That's unfortunate because one of the structural problems is not on the supply side, it's on the demand side. And yes, consumption has been growing actually relatively okay this year, in part because it bounced back from the COVID years. But structurally, China has a demand deficit. It's 38% of GDP in consumption. It would be great if it were to be 55 or 60, that people can enjoy the fruits of China's success, but it's very low. Now what China is trying to do is to move away from this big investment-driven property and infrastructure. So the question is, where's demand going to come from? Well, economists in the room know that every supply creates its own demand. This just happens to be foreign demand. So what will happen in this situation when you have a strengthening of manufacturing, China is going to produce a lot more and is going to export it. That is by itself, as an economist, you'd say, well, that's great, and people should send thank you notes to China. Politicians never think that way. So I think it will add to the tensions in the world that are there on the trade, on the decoupling side, and therefore yes, China is now exporting a lot of electric vehicles, a lot of new energy. The Europeans are already talking about tariffs. The United States has already imposed tariffs because they feel that there's been inappropriate policies underlying that success. One can debate that. Frankly, I think that is largely not correct, but that's not what politicians will ask. So I think there's going to be an increase in trade tensions because of the current policy that is being implemented in China. In the medium term, the question is really, is this Xi Jinping model state-led, manufacturing-based, lots of strong guidance to the private sector? Is that going to deliver the long-term growth, the productivity, the innovation that China needs to be on a sustainable growth path for the next 2-3 decades that it still needs? It's a question that I don't have an answer to at this point, but it's a critical question to answer, and also for the policymakers in China to still feel the stones in the river. I don't think that they necessarily have the final answer there yet. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Director Hoffman. Yeah, indeed. So they will have definitely a lot of supply side reform, 供给侧改革. So now, Professor Hoffman, Director Hoffman just remind us that we need a demand side stimulus also. And actually, so what this is, there's a problem with the state of international relations with China when export and overseas demand is also declining. And does China leadership has a good model, to promote China and to maintain the sustainable growth? We now go to Professor Li Chen. Li Chen, about the leadership strategy. Yeah, please.
Thank you so much. Too loud. First of all, congratulations for the host for organizing this really world-class conference. I'm honored to speak at this wonderful audience. I saw so many leading China hands. There's so many talents in the audience. I mean, wonderful to see you all. And also particular honor to with my fellow panelists, Yao Yang and Bird, give excellent presentations, very, very informative, very, very updated. I also look forward to Yuan Yuan and my longtime friend Paul, their presentation. You asked me to talk about the Chinese leadership strategy. Since I moved from Washington to Hong Kong in July, actually early this year, I went to Beijing every month. But also that now it's every week. And a few days ago, I was in Beijing, and also after this session, I will fly to Shanghai. This really gives me great opportunity to observe changes in China. And also, I'm privileged to meet with China's senior leaders. I met with Li Qiang, Premier Li Qiang, and Ding Xuexiang in March, and met with several Power Bureau members in April. And I'm going to see top leader in the next couple of months in Beijing and also in Guangzhou. And also met with provincial and ministry level leaders and the elites in the private sector and the intellectual community. I got a feeling that there's a very sharp contrast between the top leadership, meaning 50 people, 24 Power Bureau member, plus a state councillor, plus a member of CMC, plus some of the most important agencies. These people can look at the most secretive, classified document. Then their views from the provincial ministry level and from the elites general are quite different. That's very, very interesting observation. I think that the top leadership, in my view, will inform about going on, about the challenges the country faces. This is another observation. Of course, that the other elites also will inform about the different aspects of the challenges. But the difference is senior leadership, top leadership, is quite confident about their overall agenda and their leverage to deal with these challenges. Now, question is why? How come they reach that assessment? I think 4 things. Number one, they believe that the Chinese government, particularly after 20 Party Congress, put security, stability above the economic growth is the right strategy. And also they think it's not a uniquely Chinese. They told me, look at today's world, which country does not put security and stability first? United States, Russia, Japan, EU, name it. This is number one. And also related is that what Yao Yang said is very, very important about the stimulus plan. They're hesitant to do it. Sounds like that how bad is bad enough. But nowadays probably their understanding reached a new level with the stimulus plan. Early on, they're hesitant to use if that's the plan, right? 3.0 trillion. It's huge. So they must think that now it's about the right time to stimulate the economy. Previously, they know their side effects. There's some other contradictions they may need to address. So this is number one. They think it's put security first. It's still important, but the current adjustment is part of their agenda. Whenever they see it's needed, they will do it. Secondly, they also think that as I mentioned, that the economic growth, the balance with the common prosperity is crucial. So the previously single-minded growth model, as we all know, come to end with environment concern, carbon neutrality concern. But the more importantly is the economic strategy since Xi Jinping came to power. First, he talked about the China dream. Now he more specific, talk about common prosperity, largely target they call the middle income group, and we call the middle class. I remember that in my meeting with Li Qiang, he said China's middle class will continue to grow despite the COVID situation may slow down a little bit, but he predicts in the next few years it will increase to 500 million, from 400 million now to 500 million. You probably noticed that Ambassador Xie Feng, a couple of weeks ago in Washington Post, repeated Xi Jinping's plan that by 2035, China's middle class will double. Right now, of course, that the middle class growth is different from the previous strategy to let the monopolize private companies or some platform to continue. They particularly look at the middle class. So they hope this is a way to stimulate the 3 engines of China's growth. Chinese call it 三驾马车, namely consumption, investment, and foreign trade. None of these areas doing well, but they think this is temporary. Right now, so that's their plan. They think they will not move away. And also, they believe that another thing that most people talk about, China current situation is not good, economy is not good. But the question is, if China is not good, where is it good? They think the United States economy cannot be sustainable with this high interest rate, with this constantly printing money. You caught other countries in big trouble. Eventually, that policy we cannot go along. But even American economy is good. They are very, very critical about American politics. They think that it's in a chaos. There's no solution in the near future. I think not only Chinese government get that sentiment. I think many of us probably have the same sentiment, same concern. We talk about de-risking. I think in that regard, U.S. probably is also a country we need to think about. If political chaos, the question is, it's not which party, which candidate become president. I think the real question is, in 2024, if one person claim presidency, but the other party may not accept, that the chance is not slim. It's becoming increased. Last time, the good things is the legal system, military, and the local officials, even Republican Party, maintain their integrity, their independence. But you cannot guarantee with that development. If that, China's stability and also kind of will play a very, very important role, will eventually attract foreign capital. And also, they already believe that from Middle East, South Saudi, and some other countries probably will look at also that since I live in Hong Kong, there's tremendous effort to make sure that the Hong Kong will re-emerge as a financial center. Now, previously, 5-6 years ago, maybe earlier, they talked about Shanghai and Shenzhen will replace Hong Kong, but not anymore. So their strategy now to use Hong Kong to attract. Of course, IPO is so low and many other problems. So these things could be fixed. And finally, that of course, the stock market, the property market is so bad. But the evening market, that's the 股市、房市 are terrible. But the 夜市 is booming. Look at Shenzhen, Guangzhou, and every weekend, 500,000 of Hong Kong people move to Shenzhen to consume, restaurants or evening life and etc. But also, so many people told me in China, even in Xinjiang, in southern Xinjiang, 2 o'clock in the morning, also booming. I just had a meeting with Xie Chen's CEO. I also saw her this morning, Sun Jie. She told me that domestic travel is also coming back. So they think this kind of dynamic eventually will change the narrative. So that's the base of their confidence. Now, what I said this is their view, my observation, but at the same time, I see the validity of some of the thinking. So this is the game they want to play.
Good. Thank you very much, Professor Lee. Actually, there are already interactions and we have exchanged already, but we have to go on to Paul first, and then after that, we'll have the discussion. I have a lot of questions to ask Professor Lee and Professor Yang and Mr. Hoffman, but we will stay fit for later. So now let's shift our focus a bit towards China international relations, which actually China-US relationship is affecting China's economy and actually hurting both China and United States economy. So maybe Mr. Handler can share with us your views on China-US relationships and what can they do about this technology competition, and what do you think can be done to make both of the position better? Thanks.
Well, thank you very much, Yong Hong, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me to this distinguished panel, and it's an honor to speak to all of you. So you've left the easy topic for me, the U.S.-China relationship. I'll share some of my thoughts, and I know others on the panel will have thoughts as well. This is something that, as we look over the last decade, the changes in the U.S.-China relationship are some of the most profound. And it's really remarkable. I had an opportunity to serve as the China director for President Bush. I stayed into the Obama administration as China director for President Obama. And if you look at the relationship then versus today, it's very, very different. Now, why have we had the kind of deterioration in U.S.-China relations that we have had? What are the driving factors? And I will say up front, I was in Beijing 2 weeks ago, and if you ask that question in Beijing, you will get a very different answer than if you ask somebody in Washington, D.C. There's very little overlap between the narratives, and it's a dueling set of narratives that go back and forth. On the Chinese side, this is all about what Graham Allison, the Harvard professor, wrote in his book, The Thucydides Trap, in that there are several historical examples where a rising power is challenging an established power, and the established power moves to block the continued rise of that rising power. And in this case, everything that's happening in the relationship that's creating friction is because the US is intent to contain China and to block its rise. Within that description, there is nothing said about what China might be doing to contribute to the downturn. It's all because the United States cannot accept China's rise into the international system. Now, if you ask that question in Washington, D.C., you get a very different answer. I served in the Bush administration, as I said. I was also part of a book project recently, and I'd encourage folks to, if you want to understand the American perspective on this, from Bush administration officials, there's a book called Handoff, which came out this year. And it does something very interesting. It takes the classified memos that we wrote for the Obama administration about policy issues, including US-China, in terms of how President Bush and the administration saw the issue when they came into office in 2001, what policies they put in place based on that, how they thought it went, and what could have gone better. And they gave those to the Obama administration. Those memos are declassified and they're in the book. So you can actually, it's a very transparent thing. You can go back and you can see what the Bush administration was trying to do. And then I was part of a team to write the postscript, and, in a sense, what happened from the end of the Bush administration until now. And the basic narrative there is the Bush administration set out to, number one, accept China's rise, welcome China into the international system after decades of being isolated, worked to help facilitate China's rise, helping China get into the World Trade Organizations, working with China in other ways to integrate it into the international system. Now, certainly there's a US interest in that. If China is integrated into the international system, then China won't work to overturn the international system. But the international system is one that helped China rise in the way, in the fashion that it did. And the Bush administration set out to find areas to cooperate with China. You remember the Iran nuclear issue. US and China were cooperating with members of the P5 in Europe. You had the North Korean nuclear issue, which I was a part of. Good cooperation with China during that time. And a range of transnational issues. Bob Zellick, Deputy Secretary of State, talked about China becoming a responsible stakeholder. And I think there was a real optimism at the time. I traveled to Beijing with President Bush in 2008 at the Olympics. It was an exciting time. And I think many Americans and US policymakers envisioned a very different future for US-China relations. In the second term of the Obama administration, a number of factors started a reassessment of China's trajectory. Number one was the island building campaign in the South China Sea. That came across to Americans as very aggressive and threatening to the interests of the United States and other countries in the region. Huge, massive cyber theft of intellectual property undermined the US business community, who had previously been the ballast in the relationship between US-China, big supporter of constructive relations. And then finally, I think an inability to resolve economic and trade disputes that largely were based on the structure of China's economy. And what's interesting is when I lived in China between 2010 and 2020 with the Carnegie Endowment, many Chinese scholars, in talking about the deterioration of the relationship, would say, it's important that Americans understand when China announced its reform and opening up in the Third Plenum, by the way, in 1978, very shortly after, they announced the normalization of US-China relations. And that was not coincidental, that those two concepts are inextricably linked in the Chinese view. And so what they say is, as China moves away from the reform and opening up that we had seen over many Chinese administrations, it's not surprising to them that that's causing strains in US-China relations. So this is very much, the American narrative, that it's based on changes that are coming from China in terms of its policies, its behaviors, its trajectory, that has put us in the position, and the US has to take steps working with allies and partners to defend against that. So the question, we could debate this all day long, right? And I suspect that Americans are not going to convince Chinese, and Chinese are not going to convince Americans. So the question then becomes, going forward, what do the US and China do about it? Because I suspect that if you ask me to project over the next 10, 20 years, I think the strategic competition that we see, the rivalry that we see, will intensify. It's not going to go away. One meeting between Xi Jinping and President Biden is not going to solve all our problems. So what the two sides are going to have to do is figure out, despite the growing set of differences and the growing rivalry, how can they set up principles and operating mechanisms to manage the relationship? Secretary of State Blinken has talked about an international demand signal that the US is getting for the United States and China to manage responsibly their relationship. I think that demand signal comes from this region as well. There's a hope and expectation that the US leaders, Chinese leaders, will do what they need to do to manage the relationship responsibly. And I think that's part of what you see in the Biden administration's strong effort to reestablish a high-level set of connections between cabinet secretaries, starting with Secretary of State Blinken in June, followed by the Treasury Secretary, followed by John Kerry, the climate czar, followed by Secretary of the Commerce, Gina Raimondo. The Biden administration has taken a lot of criticism for doing that by the Republicans on Capitol Hill because they say they look desperate to have dialogue with the Chinese side. But I think the Biden administration feels if you're going to have this intense competition, it's really important that you couple that with intense diplomacy, open lines of communications, to clarify, to reassure, to make sure that we don't have the worst outcomes or it doesn't veer into greater confrontation or conflict. We've also had a congressional delegation. Senator Chuck Schumer led a congressional delegation a few weeks ago. And then earlier this week, the California governor visited China. And my hope is that we'll see Chinese senior officials now traveling to the United States. Wang Yi was in the US this week, hopefully to prepare for the meeting between President Xi and President Biden. And that's a very positive thing that they're meeting. These two leaders know each other very well. They spent a lot of time together when they were both vice president. President Xi came to the United States with Vice President Biden as his host, and Biden went to China as the host of then Vice President Xi Jinping. So it's a good opportunity to clarify policy, to provide reassurances. As I've said at the beginning, both sides have grievances towards each other. And so I don't expect that either side is going to make any major concessions. I don't think the US side is going to change its fundamental approach in how it's dealing with China. I don't expect the Chinese side will do that either. But nevertheless, it is an important meeting, and I think it's necessary that it's going to happen. And I hope the two sides can find ways to stay connected. The one thing that the two leaders can do is they can empower their bureaucracies to approach each other more constructively. And I think that's especially the case now in China. When I was in Beijing 2 weeks ago and I would ask about certain policies, why China's moving in a certain direction, if I could tell the scholar wasn't completely in agreement with the policy, the answer I would get is decisions are being made from the top. It's very top-down driven. And so from that standpoint, given the changes in the way policy is made in Beijing, it's even more important that President Biden has an opportunity to meet with President Xi so he can clarify and explain what US policy is and what it is not. Last 2 points I'll make is I hope coming out of the meeting and moving forward, I think there are two things in responding to this international demand signal to manage US-China relations more responsibly. I think there's two things that can be done. Number one, I've mentioned all the dialogue that has been reestablished, and that's really important, but it's in economic channels, it's in financial channels, it's in State Department channels. The one I didn't mention is the military-to-military channel. And given the risks of having some sort of accident or inadvertent collision in the region between a Chinese and US ship or a Chinese and US airplane, it's really important that our military leaders are talking to each other and that we have crisis management, prevention and management mechanisms to deal with something like that. Now, the Chinese have said that because the Minister of Defense Li Shangfu was sanctioned, that they were not able to restart the military-to-military dialogue. Well, I know, is been moved on, and so that does present an opportunity, I think, for the two sides to engage militarily. And the second opportunity I think the two sides have is around cooperation. In the Trump administration, President Trump did not consider in any way cooperating with US-China. I think his team was asked at one point, what do you have in mind in terms of cooperation with China? They said, we're not at that point yet. Biden administration is very different. They've put that out there as something that they want to do. In areas where we have mutual interests with China, we should be cooperating, especially on transnational issues like climate change, pandemic prevention, things like that. We have not yet begun to cooperate. And I think that is an area that should be aggressively pursued, because if you're going to have intense competition and intense rivalry, you need to have dialogue, diplomacy, and cooperation to balance that out. Let me stop there.
Thank you very much for taking the easy question of China-US relations. The last but not least for Professor Ang, maybe after the other four speakers have speak up, what do all these adds up and what is actually in this new game? Actually, it's China's new game and the new game that the world of us is facing. Yes, Prof. Ang, please.
Well, thank you very much. Well, first of all, good afternoon. And I would also like to thank the host Business China for putting together a fabulous conference. It is a special privilege, and I'm truly delighted to speak in my home country. I'm especially privileged to be speaking with distinguished experts that I've long admired and am very keen to learn from. I will try to take up the easy job of doing a rojak, of putting together these different insights, plus some of my own, and asking ourselves, what is the whole picture, if that is one? And I think if I were to distill it to one line, I would say that the Chinese economy is 1/3 cup full. We can debate the exact percentage, could be 42%, could be 27, could be 14, it doesn't really matter. I'm using 1/3 as an analogy. But I don't think that it would be accurate to say it's 50-50, because as the inputs on this panel suggest, obviously at this point, the headwinds and challenges in China outweigh the pluses. The fact that the cup in China is 2/3 empty, that has been relentlessly and widely covered in Western media, negative coverage about the Chinese economy, which some in China see as a conspiracy to make China look bad. But the truth is that there is some factual basis to the negative coverage. Weak private consumption and investment, for example, youth unemployment at record high, declining FDI flows. And these statistical facts are consistent with sentiments on the ground. I'm a researcher who studies China from the ground, so I was recently in China, and this is the first time in all my years studying China where I feel a real sense of social despondency on the ground that I've never seen before. However, I think what Western commentators fail to appreciate is that there is the 1/3 cup full. That is the part that they don't talk about. I agree with, in particular, with Professor Yao Yang and Professor Li Cheng's insights, which is, I think that the Chinese leadership has a new long-term game plan, which is they're trying to turbo force a structural shift of the Chinese economy toward advanced manufacturing. Because this can help them to achieve self-sufficiency, not only from US export controls, but also from the forces of globalization and private capitalism, which they have found very hard to predict and control. Now, to be clear, this dream is not new. The Chinese leadership has always had such a dream. But in the past 40 years, because China was such a beneficiary of global capitalism and US-China engagement, there wasn't this burning pressure of survival to actualize that dream. But now all of the conditions are here and are pushing them to take their dream very seriously. One of the ways I've tried to understand the regime under President Xi Jinping is that we can think of him as the inheritor of the first modern Chinese Gilded Age. The term Gilded Age comes from American history in the late 19th century, at a time when America was a developing country and it was fast rivaling the United Kingdom. America at the time enjoyed rapid growth, industrialization, urbanization, but at the same time it was the Gilded Age because America also suffered from corruption, inequality, financial bubbles. And if you think about it, although China has a very long 5,000-year history, it is a newcomer when it comes to modern capitalism. It still has a lot to learn, right? And so President Xi Jinping himself once said at a speech, when it comes to eradicating poverty, we have plenty of experience. But when it comes to trying to manage prosperity, we still have much to learn. So I think it is fair to say that in his first 10 years, that he and his leadership has been trying to figure out how can they deal with the excesses of a modern Chinese Gilded Age for which there is no playbook, plus you have intense US-China rivalry. So I think that they've set their game plan with confidence that what they want to do is to turbocharge a structural transformation with their goals fixed on advanced manufacturing and cutting-edge technology. Now, if that is true, then I think from that perspective, many of the indicators that matter to Western and global investors may not actually matter that much to the Chinese leadership. I'm not saying that they don't care about it. I'm just saying from their perspective, they are more focused on the direction of the country. If the direction is moving where they want to, they may not think it is as bad as global investors think. For instance, if youth unemployment is high, young people can go to the countryside. If real estate sales are slumping, let developers fail. If local public finances are not doing well, let local governments deal with it. So I think it is possible from their perspective that they actually have, as I agree with Professor Lee, a quite high amount of confidence that despite all of the bad signs, that China on the whole is moving in the right direction. So I'll leave with a kind of concluding comment about what all of this means for US-China relations. As a Singaporean who studies China and works in the United States, one of my informal observations is that I think both America and China have a tendency to underestimate each other's sources of resilience. But both are learning and they're updating their game. From Beijing's perspective, I think there's a tendency for them to not appreciate the sources of American resilience that comes from its economic and political freedoms. That they're still trying to understand. They've also underestimated
American structural power, whether it's soft or hard, from the fact that America is the architect of the global liberal order. But I think one of the lessons that the Beijing leadership might have learned is that it's too early to say that the East is rising and the West is declining. Too early. On the other side, in Washington, there's a tendency, as all of you may know, a 40-year cottage industry of predictions about when China is going to collapse. And I think on that account, there is a tendency to underestimate the tremendous capacity of the Chinese leadership to absorb the fallout of their policy decisions. If they make mistakes, which sometimes they do, they can deal with the consequences in a way that no American leaders can even imagine. And so I think both sides have a tendency to underestimate one another. I think in Washington, I would like to think, perhaps hopefully, that America is also beginning to appreciate the fact that even if they were able to quote unquote win a competition with China, America is no longer the unchallenged sole superpower because we are moving in a multipolar direction. So countries like Singapore have been vocal in saying we will not pick sides. African countries have said we will work with whichever country will provide grants to build infrastructure. And even Western Europe is not automatically falling in line with US wishes. So I think in Washington, there is also some amount of learning and updating itself to a new geopolitical reality. So in conclusion, I think as 2023 is coming to an end, we can declare that round one of US-China competition has come to an end, but round two is just about to begin. And I believe that future historians are going to say that round two is more interesting. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you to all of you. And yeah, you have opened a list of questions for us. The very first one that came to my mind was, so does anybody want to respond or react to what Prof. Ang just said? Like, is it 1/3 full and 2/3 empty, or actually no, it's far better, it's half empty, or anybody want to react? And also one question, the other question is, so this is finish of one, end of one round. So how many rounds will there be? The first thing you do, anyone want to react, to respond to anything anyone have said?
Let me say a few words about 1/3 or 2/3. I think this metaphor is really useful. I would like to take it as China's potentials have been played by 1/3. There are 2/3 potentials over there. China's economy still has a lot of potentials, but the performance, particularly the short-term performance of the Chinese economy, almost completely depends on government policy. Right? So that's actually a key to understanding China's economic performance. So that's why I believe this 3.7 trillion stimulus plan is going to work, because in the end, like Li Chen said, right, the government has decided that it's the time to do this, and it is going to work.
Well, to add one thing, you said that it all depends on Chinese government policy. Based on my contact with Chinese government senior leaders, they have different views. They think this is a multiple reasons. There's a structure change, there's a cycle change, there's a global economic slowdown, there's a legacy of trade war by Trump administration, there's the impact of relocation, decoupling. There's also that some Westerners want to put China down. There's a worry about the overreaction about the Taiwan Strait crisis. So even government has good policy, sometimes will face some uphill battles. So I do not differ from yours. But I just think that they sometimes think that the environment, multiple factors affect the current the economic situation in China.
Okay. I have a few questions coming in. I shall skip my own questions and give the opportunity to the floor, and I think I'll just read them, which are very good questions. So number one is actually one question asking Professor Lee, any chance for China to give in and resolve differences with India? So there's one question about India, and maybe Professor Lee will just answer this, response this just before I go to the rest of the questions.
Well, it's an excellent question, and I always think that if China-India relations are in good shape, it's better off for both countries, particularly for China. Now, in the deterioration of U.S.-China relations, certainly there's a multiple factors that reinforce fear and animosity. You mentioned about the South China Sea in the Obama administration. Certainly that played a very, very important role. But overall, if you believe Thucydides Trump, I have some reservation. But if you believe that, the existing power probably more fearful with the rising power. So that interprets that some of the situation, lack of confidence on the part of the United States. There's a real concern, but also there's a fear that American leadership supremacy will be challenged. So unfortunately, that the China-India relation is in terrible shape for various reasons. And also that actually there's some, for example, the relocation, a value chain, supply chain, and etc. China is not afraid that the machinery, manufacturing back to U.S. I don't think they think it will happen because the U.S. is not good in terms of labor resources, technical laborers, and the U.S. economy is largest service sector. This will not work. Now it's relocating to Southeast Asia or to Mexico. China is also not afraid because there's Chinese American, the overseas Chinese diaspora actually very much play an important role, even in Vietnam. But they really worry about the relocation going to India. China basically could not benefit and will be challenged. But the question is, I'm not in a position to answer whether India is the right place to challenge, to replace China. Some of the people in Europe, I visited Europe quite often, they think that in that regard, China is not replaceable because India is not ready for this kind of things because infrastructure, because of the its own political system or other system. So that's the reason. But nevertheless, if that Indian-China relation is better, the so-called Indo-Pacific strategy, India plays such an important role. First on board, then recently, because the narrative today's Ukraine is tomorrow's Taiwan, so make Japan and South Korea also nervous, then join that the previous unbelievable framework, the Asia version of NATO. So you see the rapid change in the regard. So India in that relation is a key. But also I think the Indian economy, from my perspective, can benefit from China in many ways. But unfortunately, it's not going to happen.
Thank you. Mr. Hanley?
I'll just say a couple things to add on to Li Cheng's comments. If you had asked me that question 6 months ago, I would have said the key to improving India-China relations was to resolving some of the challenges on the border, military challenges along the border. But I'm even more worried now because I think there are other factors at play that I hear when I talk to China experts. I think when they look at China-India, it's a very, very much a zero-sum game kind of application. And one of the things I'm beginning to hear is concerns from Beijing about India challenging China's role as the leader of the global South. And some scholars speculated that maybe President Xi didn't go to the G20 because he didn't want to support Modi in an effort to enhance India's position to play that role. I think there are also concerns, as Li Cheng has already said, about supply chains not going to China and going to India instead. There's a huge amount of zeitgeist out there for India as a destination for business, international business, supply chains, and the like. have to do due diligence to see what will work and what will not work, but I can tell you the excitement is out there. And I think that will add strains to China-India relations. So I think the situation is a little bit more dire than I thought it was a few months ago.
Or do you think China feels that India is just taking the sides with the US, so there's nothing much to talk about and do? First, Prof. Hoffman?
Well,
Mr. Hoffman?
I don't think any Indian would agree with the statement that they side with the US, but
Mhm.
I'd just like to reinforce that point on relocation of investment. And look, last year was a very strange year, the COVID year, the exit out of COVID to China. But if you look at the announced foreign direct investment, India is now much larger than China. Not saying that that all is going to be realized, but if you look at the announcements of foreign direct investment, India is bigger. And that is really quite remarkable. That hasn't happened for a very, very long time.
Part of the new game. Other questions, I will ask the two together. There's this question to Prof. Ang. So actually, I think the question came in while you were making your presentation just now before you end. So the question is, does China need to care about Western media narrative? Why don't China just ignore them and propel the economy so that it's at least China's GDP is half of GDP per cap is just half of that of US. So this one and the other one, or us together, is about the trajectory of China-US relations in 2 to 3 years. That's actually to Mr. Henley or anyone would like to answer. It's also about round 2 and what will round 2 be like.
So yeah, should the Chinese leadership care about negative news coverage? I think it is possible to some extent that some of them actually say, I don't care. But I think they cannot completely not care, because even in their new game plan, which is to turbocharge toward advanced manufacturing, China cannot do without foreign investors. It's just a shifting of economic weight, right, away from foreign and private investment to state-led investment in advanced manufacturing, but it's not a pure shift. Definitely 100% China still needs foreign investors and private investors. So the effect of the constant barrage of negative news is that it reinforces sentiments on the ground. There's loss of business confidence. So it has a practical consequence for the Chinese leadership that then makes them need to push back and say, in fact, there's some better news that you guys should also pay attention to.
Question was US-China over the next 2 to 3 years?
Trajectory of China-US relations the next 2 to 3 years.
Well, I think I'll just say one big factor on that question is the US presidential election. And that will take place November next year. So, 1 year from now. Obviously, in Washington, what you hear is there's a great deal of consensus between Republicans and Democrats on how to manage the relationship with China, getting tougher with China, pushing back in areas where China is threatening US interests and those of our allies. And I think there is a good deal of bipartisan consensus on the challenges that China represents, on the changes of policies that have come out of China that threaten US interests. There's a great deal of consensus. On how to manage it, I think there is not as much consensus. If President Biden wins, obviously we can expect continuity in terms of the US approach with China, working with allies, investing at home with legislation and industrial policy, wanting to engage in dialogue with China, wanting to cooperate with China. Those are kind of key pillars of the Biden administration's policy. If Trump is elected, I think there's a lot more uncertainty on what that means. Biden is a very traditional American foreign policy president. He was head of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He believes in American leadership in the international community. wants to be part of international institutions, wants America to be out front, wants to work with allies and partners. I think the Trump administration could have a very different approach on these issues. Now, I'll end by saying that, in China, you hear a lot of Chinese say, God, we don't want to have to deal with Trump again, because it's just every day is something new, and you've got the trade war, and it's a big problem, and it's a hassle to have to deal with a president like Trump. But I think the strategists in China would welcome a Trump administration, because his tendency is to be isolationist, doesn't work with allies and partners like the Biden administration. That creates space for China. And I think that if you talk to the strategists and the people who think more long-term, they probably are hoping for Trump to be president.
Well, yeah, if I may.
Please, Professor Lee.
Because we still do not know whether Trump will be nominee or not. Although if election is now, he probably will be elected. But it's still 1 year. I think what China worried the most is the young Republicans. You look at this Congress, the senators, congressmen, governors, etc. They are far more critical of China, far more ideological. These are the people to claim that we will have China to pay for the cost of COVID. And also, these are the people, you look at the final year of the Trump administration, you will see that they will pursue 4 policies, as some of the people already argue now, when it's a complete decoupling rather than Biden's selective decoupling. Number 2 is a regime change, overthrow Chinese Communist Party. As you know, that the Biden administration never say that. They be very, very careful, very disciplined in this one. The third one, they see China is a societal challenge. So you need to stop even education exchange with China. But the Biden administration, you see Secretary of Commerce visit to talk about continued education exchanges, culture exchanges, to separate the society with the government. And finally, on the Taiwan issue, despite some of the Chinese unhappiness with the Biden administration, I think that the Biden administration at least said that the one China policy not to change. But you look at the young Republican, you look at so many bills in the US Congress, basically just wanted to acknowledge Taiwan as an independent state. So you see the fundamental difference in this area. So I think that put the things in a different kind of situation. That's explained Xi Jinping, despite all these concerns, still probably wanted to, in the final year, to deal with the Biden administration.
Thank you. I'd like to go back to a bit on the economy. So there is a lot of speculation or a lot of expectation that there will be the third plenum coming in, maybe in November, December. There's a third plenum of the Central Committee of the Communist Party, which is actually the 45th anniversary of the 11th plenum. And then there is the 10th anniversary of Xi Jinping coming to power. So is there, looking at the economy, what would be your wish list? I would like to direct this question to Professor Yao and Mr. Hoffman. What is your wish list for this third plenum, if there is? So what policies would you like to see rolled up to help to give the China economy a good boost?
I wish first the government will stabilize the economy. We can talk about the long-term structural reform, all sorts of things, all right? But you're going to die if you cannot live until tomorrow, right? So living until tomorrow, that's the most important thing, okay? Keynes said a long, long time ago, in the long run, we all die, right? So I think the first and foremost is to stabilize the Chinese economy as soon as possible. So that's quite related to so-called confidence. If the economy is not being improving, can you imagine business people are going to have confidence? That's impossible, okay? Also, second, many people are talking about the reform. We have been talking about the reform in the last 20 years. I don't see any meaningful reform in the last 20 years. Why? My answer is very simple, because most of those hard reforms, real reforms, were actually done in the 1990s, right? Already done, okay? So I think nowadays, policies are more important than reforms. So, because in my mind, when we talk about the reform, it's always about institutional change, okay? And nowadays, I don't think we have a lot of changes or need a lot of changes in the institutions, but we do need a lot of changes in the way we make decisions, and also the aim, the implementation of the policies. Right? So that's my wish list.
Thank you. So we need policy rather than reform. Mr. Hoffman, do you agree? And what is your wish list?
I like that thought. But my first on the wish list is that it actually happens. Don't forget that we didn't have a third plenum of the 19th Party Congress. And I think that was a big miss because for a long time it was quite unclear where Xi Jinping was going with the economy. He used the third plenum to assure his term, his infinite term. So I think it is needed to have a clear expression of what the futures of policies are going to look like. And I like that policy landscape. That policy landscape should include a much stronger demand side, which has to do with the common prosperity side, social security, pension system. Second, it has to do with higher efficiency from the economy, and it has to do with the financial sector getting better returns out of all these savings that the Chinese are putting up. And the third, I think it needs to have clarity on the role of the private sector going forward, because one of the big uncertainties is for a lot of private investors, is there still space in that new Xi Jinping model for me? And I think there is, but that would need to be embedded and embellished by policies going forward. So those are the three areas. Thanks.
Well, very quickly, I actually agree with both Bird and Yao Yang. I just want to add one thing. It's probably very much in line with your thinking. Earlier I mentioned about the top leadership has confidence, but unfortunately the middle level officials and also intellectuals, entrepreneurs, they do not have so much confidence at the moment. I think that the general public probably also will be influenced by what's going on, and although they may have the mixed view, differ from both the center top leadership and the middle. So my wish list is that the third plenum can uplift the public confidence. But we also should be realistic. The third plenum will not be on economy, will not be on domestic politics, will not be on growth per se. You can see the balance between domestic and international politics. Could be international politics dominate the conference. Could be that the security and stability still overrule the economy. And could be when you talk about economic growth, still probably a lot of discussion talk about common prosperity or distribution. So we should be realistic, this kind of balance. This may not be bad, but ultimately, whether you can uplift confidence in the relatively short period of time is a challenge. It's also my personal, I think my colleagues' wish list.
Thank you very much. We have like 3 minutes more. I have a few questions here about Taiwan, about leadership succession in China, but I think we won't have time to go to these questions. Do anybody want to, let's say, why don't I use the 3 minutes so that everybody round up, whatever? Yeah. You just start from the right to the left. Thank you.
I just said my say, but so look, as I said, I think I increasingly understand where Xi Jinping is trying to bring the economy towards. The question is really, is that a sufficient element for long-term growth of 4 or 5% for the next 20 years, which China needs? China is only a $12,000 per capita economy. It still needs a lot of growth. And the question is, what is falling into place now? Is that enough? Thanks.
Take the last minute to share my wish. I hope that the Chinese leadership will signal an understanding that if the economy is not doing well,
if foreign business sentiment is poor, that actually is bad for security. I hope they understand that, because right now it's the reverse, right? Security first, economy second, and they need to understand that, in fact, if the economy is not stable, if foreigners are not returning to China, that is a security risk. So if they're able to understand that point, then I feel hopeful that China will remain open, and that everyone around the world, Americans, Singaporeans, can go back to China and interact with China. Thank you.
Thank you. Professor Yao.
Well, I want to say a few words to people here. I want to emphasize that China's bumpy road of recovery is just a temporary. The Chinese economy, in the long run, has no problem to me. Right? But that also indicates the importance of stability in government policy. Right? Over the years, I understand many of those adjustments policies, but probably the Chinese authorities can improve a lot in terms of the implementation of those policies. So if the authorities can stabilize the policy, I think people in China and people outside China will also stabilize the expectation on Chinese economy, and foreign investment will go back to China.
Has to do with foreign relations also, Mr. Hanley?
Well, why don't I say a little bit about U.S.-China trade, economic relationship? There's a huge amount of focus right now on the technology competition. And in particular, there's a lot of focus on steps that the United States has taken in terms of export controls on semiconductors, putting Chinese companies on entities lists, the outbound investment screening process. The technology competition did not start with all of these steps. This technology competition has been going for some time. Of course, we remember the document made in China 2025, which outlined China's ambitions to achieve technology self-sufficiency. I mentioned the cyber theft of intellectual property. I mean, these things have been happening for quite some time. I think it's important to keep in mind what we're talking about here that is being restricted is narrow aspects of technology that deal with national security and dual use that could be applied in a military context. And both countries are going to take steps to block off, try to protect those areas, and try to make sure that they don't give national security technology to the other side. But as Gina Raimondo said when she visited China, our Secretary of Commerce, there's still 99% of trade that doesn't deal with national security. And we need to focus a little bit on that. But to do that, we've got to be talking to each other, and I'm glad we're finally doing that.
Thank you. And Mr. Lee, Professor Lee.
I wanted to comment on Taiwan, the issue. I was in Taiwan in the past 2 days. I arrived here last night. I spent 3 hours talking to President Ma Ying-jeou, and also many hours with the current stakeholders, including those in the current administration. It's a mixed assessment. Certainly that as the election gained momentum, there are a lot of things could happen. In public event, actually, I made a point. This could be controversial, but I think that I want to share with you. I think the chance for a Taiwan war, between U.S. and China, the chance is smaller than American Civil War. Now, American Civil War is also small, but the Taiwan's conflict even smaller. Now, why? I don't think Xi Jinping will attack Taiwan. Even the election will be very bad for Beijing. 3 reasons, and progressive. The first is, how do you know you can win the war? People said he wants to have legacy. In my view, he already has a legacy with green development, poverty elimination, anti-corruption, and military reform. So you do not know whether you use it to regain Taiwan. If you fail, and the China's military have not been in the war for 40 years. Look at Russia. Look at Putin. In the beginning, so sounds like they will win very quickly. This is number one reason. Number two, even more important, if you win, so what? This is not the end of the problem. It's the beginning of all the new problems. You occupy the place with 80 or 90% of people do not have same identity. You look at the conflicts in today's world, occupation never work. Xi Jinping is not that dumb. He should understand that very, very well. And also Chinese call Taiwanese fellow Chinese, Taiwan Tongbao. Any huge casualty will be devastating, not only from the leadership perspective view, but also from Chinese perspective. Third one is Dr. Kissinger. His main message for China in his trip is in the era of AI, no one can win a war, right? So as my friend Joshua Ramo also said, that if the Ukraine war is the last war of the 20th century, the US-China war over Taiwan will be the first one in the 21st century. It's the first AI war. Now, Chinese leader does not need Kissinger to remind them. They understand. I think President Biden and the American military also understand. This will be the war. You cannot pursue like the limited war or passive war. It will escalate so quickly. I do not need to give examples. This is precisely your excellent argument that the military relation should be there. But there's some communications, that when Nancy Pelosi visited Taipei, these 2 days, 3 days before, 3 days after, I think a senior official in the White House, your friend, visited the Chinese embassy to talk to Qinggang every day. And also the final months of Trump administration, our chairman of Joint Chief, even called his counterpart, that I will not going to attack you. Even Commander-in-Chief asked me to do that. I will not do that. You can see how outraged that Trump and his followers towards that comes in. You leak the most secret information to Chinese, and they just be also traitor. But this tells you the danger, the devastating effect. If there's no one can win, so why you fight? So actually, my overall message is that we should prevent the incident. It's still real, but it could be and should be, must be avoided. So if that's the case, let's see how Taiwan election can unfold. And it's difficult to judge, but I think there's a good chance that the land and the blue and the white may unite, maybe along with Terry Gore, sometimes November. But of course, even not that happen, certainly DPP has a great chance. But there's a lot of uncertainty. If Chinese really, as I described, will not use force, but they will maximize all the non-military method to dealing with that thing because the stake is so high. So let me end up, actually, I'm more hopeful that we will get over the most difficult period now. You want to give some comment?
I think we are running out of time, and thank you very much. Thank you for the audience for your excellent questions, and thank you everyone for sharing.